Yeah, I mean, he was arguably the most influential conservative of his generation, starting with Turning Point USA, which looked to mobilize conservatives on campus. Of course, American conservatives have long complained that they don't get a fair shake on college campuses, and the professors there are too liberal, and so they saw that as sort of one front of the struggle to sort of expand the conservative tent, as you will, and Kirk really led the push on that. He was also a very early supporter and advocate for Donald Trump specifically, and spoke at its convention regularly. All this, of course, at a young age. He was 31 when he was shot and killed on Wednesday. So this is just a very, very influential figure. It's hard to really put into words. Trump, his son, Vice President Vance, everyone is putting out statements and mourning him. Of course, Trump himself this morning was the one who announced the arrest or let it be slip that there had been an arrest in the case in Utah. And so Kirk's influence is just so big. There are questions now as to where this goes, of course, including more logistical ones about who will run Turning Point. Can it still be as effective without Charlie Kirk? And more broad questions about, where we go from here. President Trump indicating that he, worries or is treating this as part of a larger left-wing effort. And we should note there's no evidence yet from investigators that that is fully the case. In other words, that this shooter was participating in some sort of network. But President Trump thinks it is growing from, left-wing protests and advocacy. In particular, this morning renewed his threat to potentially pursue some sort of racketeering investigation against George Soros, not for this, but more broadly for funding left-wing protesters. So this has the chance to sort of be the basis on which Trump tries to do stuff, and that's what's got a lot of Democrats concerned.
God, we just feel so broken, Josh, in a moment of tragedy, and all I can think about is his friends, his family, a loss of life. And I understand there's a lot of political discourse out there, and it just makes me think, like, why can't we all get along? Why can't we discuss the differences we have? What is, though, also the responsibility, perhaps, of those who know Charlie Kirk, of the president, perhaps, of the Republican Party, of conservatives, and maybe saying, hey, enough. There's been too many political targets and shootings and incidents and political violence. What's the responsibility of all politicians to step forward and say, we need to stop this? And what's the likelihood that any of that happens?
I mean, the Utah governor has been calling to take down the temperature in his press conference this morning. Of course, he's a Republican. There are calls from both parties to do that, lest this sort of spiral into other violent acts, or without that, even just sort of further embitter the partisan kind of environment that we're living in here in the U.S. But others don't see that, and there are conservative voices right now calling for, the way to sort of honor Charlie Kirk's legacy is to push back against the progressive and left-wing groups that Kirk enjoyed sparring with. And so that's really the crossroads that we're at. I should note that President Trump himself is not really among those calling to take down the temperature. He has said he supports nonviolent action, but he also called Charlie Kirk a martyr. And as I said earlier, has indicated that he plans to pursue sort of other measures in the wake of this fatal shooting on Wednesday that, of course, is being treated by authorities as a political assassination. And so it is a fraught time here, no doubt about it. And, Kirk was so influential in the conservative community that many are simply grieving, including people in this building behind me who knew him personally. This is just a tragedy where they've lost someone they know, important to their movement, but also just on a personal level. It's also true that, of course, some Democrats were not the biggest fans of Charlie Kirk, and are, those who are speaking to that right now are being seized upon by conservatives who think this is not the time to be litigating what he said or what he didn't. And so this is all just has the potential to really continue to be pretty fraught. Of course, we should know that Kirk leaves behind a wife and 2 kids. Focus on them as well right now, including from Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, who sent well wishes to his widow today. So this is just a tragedy on Wednesday. The hope, of course, is that it doesn't continue, because we have seen too many of these. Of course, shooting Minnesota lawmakers. Earlier in Minnesota, we had, of course, the arson outside Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's home. We've had shootings in the past of lawmakers, including Steve Scalise, a Republican, including Gabby Giffords, a Democrat. There have been too many of these in America, I think, is a pretty widely held view right now. And the question is, what can be done to sort of bring down the temperature and not have these sort of spiral into, God forbid, more violent acts. That's not something we should, anyone wants to see happen. I should note that President Trump is emphasizing, though, the acts that have targeted Republicans, not so much the ones that have targeted Democrats. So he's feeding sort of his audience a different view, a partial view of the overall landscape of political violence that we're seeing in America over recent years.
Yeah. As we know, violence doesn't distinguish between parties, and we certainly have seen that play out. Josh, I just want to layer something else on top of it, and has come out in some of the reporting and pointing to global forces kind of jumping on and seizing on, this moment of tragedy and turbulence in American politics. Is there anything to that?
I think it's a little early to say yet, but there certainly are concerns and reports and indications that, essentially bot armies are pouring gas on the fire, for lack of a better phrase. And that is a concern that predated the fatal shooting of Charlie Kirk. To what extent are, through social media platforms, Americans being exposed or manipulated by foreign actors? This is a long-standing issue. We just don't know yet how much it's playing here. But of course, yeah, it's a concern that this is just another partisan issue that can be sort of seized upon by America's enemies to inflame domestic political tensions.